All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive today into a case that's really going to make you think: the Harbor City serial shootings back in 1993.
Ooh, yeah.
We're going off a few things here, some Wikipedia entries and some old news articles we dug up. And let me tell you, this case is cold.
Coal. This one is like buried under an avalanche, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We're talking about unsolved drive-by shootings in L.A.
The buys.
Yeah, specifically targeting black men. And it really left the whole community terrified,
Yeah.
you know? And to top it all off, the person who did it, they just vanished like a ghost.
Just disappeared.
Oof.
I gotta say, reading through all this, the thing that gets me is how these attacks seem so random at first, but then you realize they all happened in a super specific spot, like all within just a couple of blocks in Harbor City. That's gotta be a huge clue, right?
It's almost like they knew the area.
Yeah, or like they were trying to send a message. But let's go back to the beginning, break it down.
All right, so rewind back to January 31st, 1993. That's when the first victim, Howard L. Campbell, 32 years old, was killed.
Killed.
Yeah, shot and killed at 1087 West 252nd Street. Now, get this. Not even 2 weeks later, Valentine's Day, to be exact, another man, Michael Kevin Medor, 35, is killed at the same address.
The exact same address.
The exact same address.
Wow. Okay, so two shootings, same location, both victims, black men. I mean, that's a serious pattern right there.
It's scary.
It's not just about the escalation either. It's the fact that they chose the same place twice. Like, the perpetrator was either really comfortable there or maybe even had a connection to the victims. I mean, that's a thought, right?
That's chilling.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there. 2 months later, April 15th, Joseph Alexander Maxwell, who was only 26, is killed just 2 blocks away, Hetho 39 West 254th Street.
So we're talking, what, a 4-block radius, max?
Super tight area, right?
Now,
You'd think that would make it easier for the police to figure out who did it, right?
Yeah.
Narrow down the suspects or something.
you would think, but we got to remember, this was 1993. It wasn't like today. DNA analysis was just starting to be used, and police departments didn't really share information as easily as they do now. Plus, think about it, no cell phone records, no internet databases, none of that stuff.
It was a different world back then.
Totally different. But hold on, there's a twist in this story.
Okay.
On May 22nd, there's another attack. This time it's on the 1100 block of West 253rd Street. And this time, the victim survives. He's a 38-year-old man, and he's able to give the police a description of the shooter.
So now they have a witness. Finally, a break in the case.
Huge break. The surviving victim described a white male between 25 and 35 years old, red hair, driving a red Jeep with a white top.
A red Jeep.
Red Jeep with a white top, and guess what? Some of the witnesses from the other shootings, they remembered seeing a guy like that around the time of the attacks.
So they had multiple people seeing this guy.
Yeah, and the police even put together a composite sketch, like one of those drawings they make based on witness descriptions. You'd think with all that they would have caught the guy, right?
I mean, it seems like they had everything they needed. So what happened? Why is this case still cold? Did the police just mess up somehow?
Well, it's easy to look back now and say they should have done this or that, but we gotta remember, things were different back then. Evidence could have been lost, or maybe the police just didn't handle it properly. And then there's always the chance that the guy just took off, skipped town, maybe even left the state.
So he could be anywhere.
Anywhere. Plus, like I said, police departments weren't as connected back then. Information might not have been shared as quickly as it is now, so lots of possibilities.
Okay, but what about a motive? Surely they figured out why this guy was targeting people, right? Was it a robbery? Like maybe something went wrong? Or was it personal? Like, did he have a grudge against someone?
That's the really creepy part of this whole thing. There's no clear motive. I mean, yeah, all the victims were black men, so of course people wondered if it was a hate crime, right? But the police, they couldn't say for sure.
And they ruled out robbery.
Totally ruled it out.
So just imagine the fear in that community. You're a black man in Harbor City in 93, and suddenly you could be the next target, and nobody knows why.
It's terrifying, right?
Like a nightmare.
And not knowing why, that just makes it even worse. Like, there's this boogeyman out there, and he could strike anyone, anytime. Makes you look over your shoulder constantly, doesn't it?
Totally. And it's not just some ghost story either, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Wikipedia article puts this case under a bunch of categories. Crime in Los Angeles, cold case, obviously, but also gun violence in the United States, and even list of serial killers in the United States.
Whoa.
This wasn't just some random thing. This was a sign of a much bigger problem.
It's true. Those categories, they show us how the Harbor City shootings weren't unique. Sadly, there's a much bigger and more disturbing pattern of gun violence, unsolved crimes, and the impact they have on communities. It's a big problem.
It's almost like this case is a small example of these huge societal issues.
It's,
It makes us think about some really uncomfortable truths.
yeah, for sure.
But before we go too far down that road,
Yeah.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the perpetrator being familiar with the area.
Hmm.
What does that tell us from like an investigation standpoint?
Well, it tells us that the guy probably had some connection to Harbor City. Maybe he lived there, worked there, or at least knew people there. That's a big detail, right? Investigators could have used that to narrow down their suspects. They could have looked at people with criminal records in the area, checked out local businesses, talked to people who live there. Maybe someone recognized the guy from that composite sketch.
Wow, it's amazing how one small detail can change everything about an investigation, right?
Absolutely. And this case, it really makes you think about all the different things the police could have done. It's full of what ifs. Those what ifs and maybes that you always get with cold cases.
And that's what makes this case so interesting, right? We have all these pieces of the puzzle, the timeline, the victims, the witness descriptions, even the composite sketch. But for some reason, it's still a mystery. It's
Yeah.
like we're standing at the edge of this dark, scary place, trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah, it's like trying to see through a fog, and you can just barely make out the shapes, but you can't quite figure out what they are.
And it's a fog that's been hanging over this case for decades.
It really has.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to put together one of those connect the dots puzzles,
Uh-huh.
but some of the dots are missing, and the picture is well, pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
It's funny you should mention that composite sketch, though, because I was just thinking about how those things, even if they're not perfect, can really bring a case to life.
For sure.
Like I can almost picture the guy driving around Harbor City in that red Jeep of his looking for, I don't know, it's just,
Right, like it suddenly becomes more real.
yeah, it makes you realize these weren't just names in a police report. These were
Yeah.
real people with lives, families, futures, all cut short.
And for the surviving victim, the guy who gave that description, can you imagine what that must have been like to come face to face with the person who tried to kill you and then to have to carry that memory with you, the burden of survival?
It's something we don't always think about, right? Like the trauma, the psychological impact, that stuff doesn't just go away when the news stops covering it.
Exactly.
And it's not just the surviving victim either. The families of the men who were killed, the investigators who worked on the case, even the people who lived in Harbor City at the time, they were all affected by this.
It's like a ripple effect. That fear, that uncertainty, it spreads through the whole community.
Yeah.
And the fact that they never caught the guy, that just adds to the anxiety.
It's like this open wound that never quite heals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like a ghost story that never wins.
And it makes you wonder, could this case be solved today with all the technology and advancements we have now? Like, what if they reopened the case and used modern forensics, DNA analysis, all that stuff?
It's definitely possible. We've come a long way since 1993, right? I mean, think about it. DNA technology is way more advanced now. We have these huge databases full of information. And then you've got the power of the internet, social media, all these online communities dedicated to solving cold cases. It's amazing.
So you're saying there's still hope, even after all these years, that they
Yeah.
could finally catch this guy and get justice for the victims?
Absolutely. It happens all the time, actually. Cold cases get solved years, even decades later because of new leads, fresh perspectives, new technology. Who knows? Maybe this deep dive will spark someone's memory. Or maybe someone out there has a piece of information they didn't realize was important before. You never know.
It's true. I remember reading about this one case where they finally solved it because someone saw a documentary about it and it triggered a memory. Some tiny detail they had forgotten about, but it ended up being the missing link.
It's amazing how our brains work, right? Like a smell, a sound, an image. It can just unlock these memories we didn't even know we had. That's why it's so important to keep these cases in the public eye, to keep talking about them.
It keeps the hope alive.
Exactly. And it's not just about solving the puzzle either. It's about the victims, their families. They deserve closure. They deserve justice.
Absolutely. It's about holding someone accountable for what they did, no matter how much time has passed.
And, as we're talking about all this, I keep thinking about the bigger picture. We mentioned those Wikipedia categories earlier, right? Gun violence, serial killers, crime in Los Angeles. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was part of a much bigger pattern, a reflection of the problems that were going on in America, and especially in LA back in the early 90s.
Yeah, like the Rodney King riots, the gang violence. It was a really tense time.
Right, all those things contributed to the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that was hanging over LA back then. It's like this case is a snapshot of a city on edge struggling with these huge social and political issues. And in a lot of ways, those same issues are still with us today.
That's true.
I mean, that's the thing about history, right? We can learn from it, but it also has a way of repeating itself if we're not careful.
Yeah, it's like we can see the parallels between then and now. And that's what's so powerful about looking back at these historical events.
Hmm.
They give us a window into the past, but they also hold up a mirror to the present. They make us confront the things we might not want to see.
Exactly. And maybe that's the most important thing we can take away from this deep dive. It's not just about the facts of the case. It's about what those facts tell us about ourselves, about our society, about the things we value, the fears we have, the questions we still need to answer. It's a reminder that these stories, these cases, no matter how disturbing or confusing they might be, are ultimately about people. The victims, their families, the communities impacted by violence and loss. Their stories deserve to be heard, their memories honored, and their search for justice supported.
And maybe, just maybe, by exploring these stories, by shining a light into the darkness, we can find some hope, some way to heal, some way to prevent these tragedies from happening again.
That's a powerful thought. And it brings us back to that question, right? What if we hold the missing piece of the puzzle? What if a forgotten memory, a tiny detail, could be the key to finally bringing closure to this case?
It might sound crazy, but it's happened before. Sometimes all it takes is one person, one spark of recognition to ignite the flame of justice.
And that's why these deep dives are so important. They're not just about reliving the past, they're about actively engaging with it, searching for those missing pieces, those connections that might have been overlooked. They're about keeping the hope alive, no matter how small it might seem.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Harbor City shootings, I'm left with this mix of emotions, sadness for the victims, frustration that we still don't have all the answers, but also this feeling of determination to keep searching for the truth. And it feels like, with this case especially, the road to justice has been anything but a straight line.
Yeah, more like a maze, right? Full of dead ends, wrong turns, and just when you think you've lost all hope, you get a little glimmer of something, some clue that keeps you going.
But the longer a case stays unsolved, the harder it gets, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
the details start to fade, people move on,
Yeah.
and that sense of urgency, it kind of disappears.
And that's what the person who did it is hoping for, right? That everyone will forget, that the trail will go cold, and their actions will be lost to time. But that's why what we're doing is so important. By looking back at these cases, by digging through the old files, by having these deep dives, we're saying no to that, right?
We're keeping the story alive.
Exactly.
And maybe our conversation today, who knows, maybe it'll spark something in someone's memory. Maybe someone out there has a piece of information that could break this case wide open.
It's possible, right? You never know what might trigger a memory.
And even if we don't solve it today, even if the answers stay hidden, there's still meaning in trying, right? In searching for the truth, no matter how long it takes.
Absolutely. It's about more than just catching the bad guy,
Yeah.
It's about honoring the victims, remembering the pain that this case caused, making sure their stories aren't forgotten.
And it's about showing that even when things seem hopeless, even when the trail has gone cold, we never really give up on justice.
Yeah. Right. It's a testament to the human spirit, that need for truth, for accountability, it never really goes away.
I like that.
That's powerful.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Harbor City shootings, I want to leave everyone with this thought. What if you, the person listening right now, what if you have the missing piece? What if there's something you remember, some detail, even if it seems small or unimportant, that could help bring closure to this case?
It might sound crazy, but stranger things have happened, right? Sometimes the smallest spark can set off the biggest change. So if you're listening and something's nagging at you, some memory, some feeling, don't ignore it. You might hold the key to solving this mystery and finally bringing peace to the victims and their families.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of a cold case. Remember, the search for truth and justice never really ends. Stay curious, keep asking those questions, and never give up hope. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.